What happens when a quiet woman sitting in the back of a crowded airplane suddenly becomes the only thing standing between 200 passengers and certain death? What happens when that same woman, who spent the entire flight reading a romance novel and politely declining offers for extra peanuts, reveals a secret that changes everything anyone thought they knew about strength, courage, and what it truly means to serve your country? This is not a story about superhuman abilities or Hollywood magic. This is about Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old woman who carried grocery bags, worried about her credit card bills, and called her mother every Sunday just like millions of other people. But Sarah also carried something else, a secret that would save lives and challenge everything society believes about who can be a hero. In a world where we often judge books by their covers and make assumptions based on appearances, Sarah's story reminds us that extraordinary courage often comes in the most ordinary packages. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who never need to prove their power. Sometimes the real heroes are sitting right next to us, and we never know it until the moment everything changes. Get ready for a journey that will make you question everything you think you know about strength, service, and the incredible power of quiet determination. Sarah Chen adjusted her reading glasses and turned another page of her paperback romance novel, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours, her carefully guarded secret would be exposed to a plane full of strangers. The Tuesday morning flight from Seattle to Miami was only half full, giving passengers plenty of space to spread out and get comfortable for the 5-hour journey ahead. She had deliberately chosen seat 23F, a window seat toward the back of the aircraft, far from the business travelers who dominated the front rows with their loud phone calls and important meetings. Sarah preferred the quiet anonymity of the back section, where she could read her book, listen to music, and blend into the background just like she had learned to do in most areas of her life. The flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Rebecca with perfectly styled blonde hair, stopped by her row during the beverage service. "What can I get you to drink, honey?" she asked with a warm smile. "Just water, please," Sarah replied softly, barely looking up from her book. She had always been polite but reserved with strangers, a habit that had served her well throughout her life. Most people saw her as shy, maybe even boring, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Rebecca handed her the plastic cup of ice water and noticed the book cover. "Oh, I love romance novels. Is that a good one?" Sarah smiled slightly. "It's about a woman who falls in love with a mysterious stranger who turns out to be hiding his true identity." "Those are the best kind of stories," Rebecca laughed. "The ones where people aren't what they seem." If only she knew, Sarah thought to herself as the flight attendant moved on to the next row. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was reading about hidden identities while living one of the most carefully concealed double lives imaginable. To everyone who knew Sarah Chen in her civilian life, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet, somewhat introverted woman who worked as a technical writer for a software company in Seattle. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment, drove a reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic, and spent her weekends hiking the beautiful trails around the Pacific Northwest or curled up at home with a good book. Her co-workers saw her as competent but unremarkable, the kind of person who always met her deadlines and never caused drama but rarely spoke up in meetings or joined them for happy-hour drinks. Her neighbors knew her as the polite young woman in apartment 4B who always held the elevator and never complained about noise. Her family saw her as their sweet, bookish daughter who had chosen a safe, predictable career and seemed content with her quiet, ordinary life. None of them had any idea that for the past 6 years, Sarah Chen had been living a double life that would have seemed impossible if it weren't absolutely true. None of them knew that the woman who needed help opening particularly stubborn jars and who got nervous speaking to groups larger than 3 people was actually one of the most elite warriors in the United States military. Sarah was a Navy SEAL. She was part of an experimental program that had been carefully hidden from public view, a program that challenged every assumption about what a SEAL could be. While the world debated whether women should be allowed in combat roles, Sarah and a handful of other extraordinary women had been proving themselves in the most demanding military operations on the planet. The program had been her idea, actually. Fresh out of MIT with degrees in computer engineering and cybersecurity, Sarah had been recruited by the Navy for her technical skills. But, during her initial training, something remarkable had happened. Despite her small stature and quiet demeanor, she had not only kept up with the physical demands but had excelled in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Her scores on the initial fitness tests were good but not exceptional. What was exceptional was her mental toughness, her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and her strategic thinking abilities. When the trainers pushed her to her limits, she didn't break. When they presented her with impossible scenarios, she found solutions that no one else had considered. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Navy psychologist overseeing the program, had been the first to recognize Sarah's potential. Physical strength is important, she had explained to the skeptical commanders, but mental strength is what separates good soldiers from great ones. This woman has something special. The experimental program was designed to test whether the right individuals could succeed as SEALs regardless of gender, focusing on mental resilience, strategic thinking, and specialized skills rather than just raw physical power. Sarah's combination of technical expertise and unexpected mental toughness made her an ideal candidate. The training had been the hardest thing Sarah had ever done, harder than anything she had imagined possible. The physical demands were brutal, pushing her body to limits she didn't know existed. But even more challenging was learning to access a part of herself that she had kept hidden for most of her life, the part that was fierce, determined, and absolutely unwilling to quit no matter what obstacles were thrown in her way. Her instructors had been skeptical at first. How could this quiet, bookish woman who looked like she belonged in a library rather than a battlefield possibly handle the demands of being a SEAL? But, week after week, Sarah proved them wrong. When other candidates dropped out, she kept going. When the physical challenges seemed impossible, she found a way. When the mental pressure became overwhelming, she remained calm and focused. The most difficult part hadn't been the physical training or even the dangerous missions. The most difficult part had been learning to live two completely separate lives. When she was deployed, she was Sarah the SEAL, confident, decisive, and absolutely lethal when necessary. When she returned to her civilian life, she was Sarah the technical writer, quiet, unassuming, and completely ordinary. The transition between these two worlds required a level of mental compartmentalization that few people could manage. She couldn't tell her family and friends where she really went on her frequent business trips. She couldn't explain why she sometimes came home with small injuries that she attributed to hiking accidents or clumsiness. She couldn't share the most significant and challenging experiences of her life with the people who were supposed to be closest to her. Sometimes the weight of maintaining this double life felt overwhelming. There were moments when she wanted nothing more than to tell someone, anyone, the truth about who she really was and what she was capable of. But the nature of her work required absolute secrecy, and Sarah had learned to carry secrets as naturally as she carried her carefully curated civilian persona. The airplane hit a patch of turbulence, causing several passengers to look up nervously from their books and laptops. Sarah didn't even flinch. After years of jumping out of aircraft in combat zones and navigating through hostile territory, a little commercial airline turbulence was barely noticeable. She turned another page of her romance novel and continued reading about the heroine who was slowly discovering that her mysterious love interest was hiding important secrets. 2 rows ahead of her, a businessman named Marcus Thompson was getting increasingly agitated about the turbulence. He was a frequent flyer who considered himself experienced with air travel, but something about this particular flight was making him nervous. The turbulence seemed more severe than usual, and he had noticed that the pilots had been in and out of the cockpit several times during the flight, which was unusual. Marcus was the kind of person who prided himself on being observant and in control. As a successful financial advisor, he was used to being the smartest person in the room and having all the answers. The idea that he might be in a situation where he had no control and no information was deeply unsettling to him. Behind him, in seat 19C, Dr. Jennifer Martinez was trying to calm her own nerves about the flight. As an emergency room physician, she was used to handling crisis situations, but she was also used to being in charge of those situations. Being a passenger on an airplane meant putting her safety in someone else's hands, which went against every instinct she had developed during her medical career. Jennifer had noticed the same things Marcus had observed, plus a few additional details that her medical training had made her sensitive to. The flight attendants seemed unusually tense, despite their professional smiles and cheerful demeanor. There had been several announcements about minor mechanical issues that were nothing to worry about, but Jennifer knew enough about crisis management to recognize when people were trying a little too hard to project calm confidence. In the very back row, an elderly veteran named Robert Hayes was also becoming concerned about the flight. At 73 years old, Robert had flown on countless military transport aircraft during his service in Vietnam, and he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something wasn't right with an aircraft. The sounds were slightly off, the way the plane was handling the turbulence felt wrong, and the crew's behavior was sending up red flags that only someone with his experience would notice. Robert had spent 45 years after his military service working as a commercial pilot, so he understood both sides of the aviation equation. He knew what normal looked like, and this flight was not normal. But, like the other concerned passengers, he had no way of knowing exactly what was wrong or how serious the situation might be. None of these worried passengers had any reason to pay attention to the quiet young woman in 23F who was calmly reading her romance novel and, occasionally sipping her water. Sarah looked exactly like what she was pretending to be, an ordinary civilian passenger who was completely oblivious to any potential problems with the flight. But Sarah was far from oblivious. Her training had made her hyper-aware of her surroundings at all times, even when she was trying to maintain her civilian cover. She had noticed everything the other passengers had observed, plus several additional details that her specialized training had taught her to recognize. The subtle changes in engine sound, the unusual flight path corrections, the way the crew was communicating with each other through carefully neutral expressions, all of it pointed to a serious problem that was being carefully managed to avoid passenger panic. Sarah's military training had taught her that the worst time to reveal your true capabilities was during the early stages of a crisis, when the situation was still unclear and there might be other solutions available. The best approach was to remain alert and ready while allowing the people whose job it was to handle the situation to do their work. If and when their efforts failed and lives were in immediate danger, that would be the time to act. She closed her romance novel and carefully placed it in the seat pocket in front of her, making sure to mark her place for later. Then, she did something that would have looked completely normal to anyone watching but was actually a carefully practiced routine that prepared her mentally and physically for whatever might come next. Sarah closed her eyes and began a breathing exercise that her SEAL instructors had taught her for maintaining calm focus under extreme stress. To anyone observing, she appeared to be taking a nap or possibly meditating. In reality, she was running through mental checklists of emergency procedures, assessing the aircraft layout and passenger manifest for potential resources and complications, and preparing herself to transition from Sarah the civilian to Sarah the SEAL if the situation required it. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, sitting on an airplane full of people who saw her as just another passenger, while she was possibly the most qualified person on the aircraft to handle whatever crisis might be developing. But her effectiveness depended entirely on maintaining her cover until the moment when revealing her true capabilities would make the difference between life and death for everyone on board. As the airplane continued its journey toward what everyone hoped would be an ordinary landing in Miami, Sarah Chin sat quietly in seat 23F, looking exactly like the kind of person who would need rescuing if something went wrong. None of her fellow passengers could have imagined that if disaster struck, she might very well be the one doing the rescuing. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came 90 minutes into the flight, when Captain James Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that was clearly designed to sound routine but carried undertones that made several passengers sit up straighter in their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties that are going to require us to make an unscheduled landing in Atlanta. This is purely a precautionary measure, and there's no immediate danger to passengers or crew. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 45 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for early arrival procedures." Sarah's eyes snapped open immediately. In her civilian life, she might have accepted this announcement at face value and simply been mildly annoyed about the delay. But her military training had taught her to listen for what people weren't saying as much as what they were saying, and Captain Rodriguez's carefully controlled voice told a story that was very different from his reassuring words. The phrase "minor technical difficulties" was almost certainly a significant understatement. The instruction for flight attendants to prepare for early arrival procedures was code that suggested they were preparing for an emergency landing rather than a routine diversion. Most telling of all was what the captain hadn't said. He hadn't provided any specific details about the nature of the problem or given passengers any real timeline for when they might continue their journey to Miami. Around her, Sarah could see that other passengers were having different reactions to the announcement. Some seemed genuinely unconcerned, already pulling out their phones to text family members about the delay or checking airline apps to see about rebooking connecting flights. Others were clearly worried but trying to hide it, adopting the kind of forced calm that people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. Marcus Thompson, the businessman 2 rows ahead, was gripping his armrests with white knuckles while trying to maintain an expression of casual annoyance. Dr. Jennifer Martinez was unconsciously doing a mental inventory of her medical training and wondering what kind of emergency medical situations might arise if the landing didn't go smoothly. Robert Hayes, the elderly veteran in the back row, was studying the flight attendants' faces and body language with the kind of careful attention that comes from decades of experience in situations where other people's competence could mean the difference between life and death. Rebecca, the cheerful flight attendant who had served Sarah her water earlier, was now moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she was double-checking every safety procedure with unusual care. The other flight attendants were doing the same thing, their professional smiles now looking slightly strained as they prepared for whatever was coming. Sarah made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her civilian persona. She quietly unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to the back of the aircraft, ostensibly to use the restroom but actually to get a better view of the entire cabin and assess the situation more thoroughly. The walk down the aisle gave her a chance to observe things that weren't visible from her seat. She could see that several passengers were becoming increasingly agitated, despite the crew's efforts to maintain calm. There were families with small children who were starting to pick up on the adults' anxiety, even though they didn't understand what was happening. There were elderly passengers who looked frightened and confused, and there were business travelers who were clearly frustrated about the disruption to their schedules. More importantly, Sarah could see potential resources. Robert Hayes, the veteran in the back row, had the kind of alert, capable look that suggested military experience. Dr. Martinez was wearing scrubs under her jacket, clearly indicating medical training. There was a woman in row 15 whose confident posture and quick, efficient movements suggested she might have law enforcement or emergency services background. Sarah also noticed potential problems. There was a man in row 8 who was becoming increasingly drunk and belligerent, despite the fact that the flight attendants had clearly cut him off from alcohol service. There was an extremely nervous flyer in row 12 who was hyperventilating and might become hysterical if the situation deteriorated. There were several passengers who were clearly in poor physical condition and might need assistance in an emergency evacuation. When she reached the restroom, Sarah didn't actually go inside. Instead, she positioned herself where she could overhear the conversation between 2 flight attendants who were talking in hushed, urgent tones near the galley area. "How bad is it really?" the younger attendant, named Katie, was asking Rebecca. Rebecca glanced around to make sure no passengers were listening, then spoke in a voice so low that only someone with Sarah's trained hearing could have picked up the words. "Bad. The hydraulic system is failing, and they're not sure they can control the landing gear. Captain Rodriguez is good, maybe the best I've ever flown with, but this is the kind of situation where even the best pilots need some luck." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Hydraulic failure was one of the most dangerous mechanical problems an aircraft could experience, especially during landing. Without proper hydraulic pressure, the pilots would have limited control over critical flight systems including the landing gear, flight controls, and braking systems. Even with perfect weather and an ideal runway, this was the kind of emergency that could easily result in a catastrophic crash. Katie's face went pale. "Should we tell the passengers?" "Absolutely not," Rebecca replied firmly. "The last thing we need is panic. Our job is to keep everyone calm and follow emergency procedures exactly as we've been trained. If this goes bad, panicked passengers are going to make everything worse." Sarah quietly returned to her seat, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just heard. The situation was potentially fatal for everyone on the aircraft, but revealing her true identity and capabilities at this stage would accomplish nothing except creating more chaos. The flight crew was competent and following proper procedures. The pilots were undoubtedly doing everything possible to manage the crisis. Her training told her to wait and stay ready, but not to act until action was actually needed. But Sarah also began to mentally prepare for the possibility that action might be needed very soon. She started running through emergency scenarios in her mind, thinking about what would happen if the landing attempt failed, if the aircraft crashed, or if they ended up in a situation where civilian emergency responders couldn't reach them quickly enough. Her SEAL training had included extensive emergency medical training, crisis management, and leadership under extreme pressure. She knew how to triage injuries, perform emergency medical procedures, and organize civilian resources in disaster situations. She also knew how to make split-second life or death decisions and take charge of chaotic situations where other people were paralyzed by fear or confusion. But all of that training was useless if she revealed her capabilities at the wrong moment and simply added to the panic instead of helping to solve the problem. 20 minutes later, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom again, and this time there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation, despite his continued efforts to sound calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Due to the technical difficulties I mentioned earlier, this landing is going to be a bit different from what you're used to. I need everyone to listen carefully to the flight attendants and follow their instructions exactly. We're going to ask you to assume the brace position during landing, and we'll have emergency vehicles standing by on the runway as a precautionary measure. The words brace position and emergency vehicles sent a wave of fear through the cabin that was almost visible. Passengers who had been trying to stay calm suddenly realized that they weren't dealing with a minor inconvenience but with a potentially life-threatening emergency. A woman in row 6 started crying. The drunk passenger in row 8 became belligerent, demanding to know why no one had told him how serious the situation was. Several people began frantically making phone calls to family members, creating a cacophony of overlapping conversations as everyone tried to say what they thought might be their final goodbyes. The nervous flyer in row 12 began hyperventilating so severely that Dr. Martinez left her seat to help, introducing herself as a physician and beginning to provide medical assistance. Robert Hayes stood up and began moving through the cabin, using his calm, authoritative presence to help reassure other passengers and assist the flight attendants with crowd control. Sarah watched all of this unfold from her seat, every instinct screaming at her to take charge of the situation. Her training had taught her that the first few minutes of an emergency were critical for establishing calm, organized response procedures. The longer chaos was allowed to continue, the harder it became to regain control and the more likely it was that people would make panic-driven decisions that put everyone in greater danger. But she also knew that revealing her military background at this moment could backfire badly. Civilians sometimes reacted unpredictably to the presence of military personnel in emergency situations, especially when they felt they had been deceived about someone's identity. Some people would be reassured by her presence, but others might become angry or suspicious, wondering what else they hadn't been told about the flight or the emergency. Instead, Sarah began doing what she could within the constraints of her civilian cover. She quietly moved to help an elderly woman who was struggling with her seatbelt, offering calm reassurance without claiming any special knowledge or authority. She helped a mother with young children get organized for the emergency landing, speaking in a steady, confident voice that seemed to have a calming effect on everyone around her. Most importantly, she began to position herself strategically within the cabin. Without making it obvious, she moved to an aisle seat that would give her quick access to the emergency exits and allow her to assist with evacuation procedures if necessary. She also made mental note of where the most vulnerable passengers were located and began planning how she could help them if the landing went badly. As the airplane began its final approach to Atlanta, Sarah Chin sat quietly in her new seat, looking to everyone around her like just another frightened passenger who was trying to stay calm in a dangerous situation. None of her fellow passengers had any idea that they now had one of the most highly trained emergency response specialists in the world sitting among them, ready to spring into action the moment her help was needed. The critical moment was approaching, and Sarah could feel herself beginning the mental transition from her civilian persona to her SEAL identity. Soon, very soon, she might need to stop pretending to be ordinary and reveal exactly what she was capable of doing when lives hung in the balance. The final approach to Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport was unlike anything the passengers had ever experienced. Instead of the smooth, controlled descent they were accustomed to, the aircraft was shuddering and lurching as Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain control with severely compromised hydraulic systems. Every few seconds, the plane would drop suddenly or veer to one side, causing passengers to grip their armrests and each other as they tried to prepare for whatever was coming. Sarah could feel the aircraft's distress in her bones. Her years of experience in military aircraft had given her an intimate understanding of how planes were supposed to feel during normal operations, and everything about this approach was wrong. The engines were working harder than they should be, the control surfaces weren't responding normally, and the whole aircraft felt like it was barely holding together. Through her window, she could see the ground approaching much faster than usual, and at an angle that suggested the pilots were having trouble controlling their rate of descent. In the distance, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles that were already positioned along the runway, ready to respond to whatever happened when the aircraft finally reached the ground. Rebecca and the other flight attendants were moving through the cabin with admirable professionalism, helping passengers prepare for the emergency landing. But Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, despite their training and their efforts to project calm confidence. They knew as well as anyone how dangerous this situation had become. "Ladies and gentlemen, please assume the brace position now," Rebecca announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Head down, hands behind your head, feet flat on the floor. Stay in position until we come to a complete stop and the captain gives the all-clear." Around the cabin, passengers began following the instructions with varying degrees of success. Some assumed the position correctly, while others were clearly struggling with fear and confusion. The drunk passenger in row 8 was arguing loudly with a flight attendant, refusing to follow instructions and demanding to know why no one would tell him the truth about what was happening. The nervous flyer in row 12 was sobbing hysterically, despite Dr. Martinez's continued efforts to calm her. Sarah assumed the brace position like everyone else, but she didn't close her eyes or try to shut out what was happening around her. Instead, she remained hyper-alert, listening to every sound and monitoring the situation for any sign that she might need to take action. Her SEAL training had taught her that the moments immediately before and after a crash were often when quick thinking and decisive action could mean the difference between life and death for multiple people. The first contact with the runway was harder than any commercial landing should be, jarring everyone in their seats and causing several people to cry out in fear. But the aircraft stayed intact and upright, which was the first piece of good news they had received in over an hour. The bad news became apparent immediately afterward. Instead of the gradual deceleration that passengers expected, the aircraft began to skid sideways down the runway, completely out of control. The sounds of grinding metal and failing systems filled the cabin as Captain Rodriguez fought desperately to bring the plane to a stop before they ran out of runway or worse. Sarah could tell from the way the aircraft was moving that they were in serious danger of crashing into something or rolling over. The pilots had managed to get them onto the ground, which was a remarkable feat given the circumstances, but they were far from safe. Emergency vehicles were racing alongside the aircraft, their sirens barely audible over the noise of the crisis unfolding inside the cabin. Then, with a tremendous grinding crash that threw everyone forward against their seatbelts, the aircraft finally came to a stop. For a few seconds, there was an eerie silence as passengers tried to process what had just happened and whether they were still alive. The silence was broken by Captain Rodriguez's voice over the intercom, and, for the first time during the entire crisis, he sounded genuinely shaken. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on the ground and we're safe. However, we need to evacuate the aircraft immediately. Flight attendants, initiate emergency evacuation procedures now." That announcement transformed the cabin from tense silence into barely controlled chaos. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and standing up, many of them moving toward the exits before the flight attendants could provide proper instructions. The drunk passenger in row 8 was now completely belligerent, shouting at everyone around him and demanding to get off the plane immediately. Several people were crying, others were trying to make phone calls, and everyone seemed to be talking at once. Sarah could see that the evacuation was about to become disorganized and dangerous. In emergency situations, panicked crowds could be just as deadly as the original crisis, especially when people were trying to move quickly through narrow aircraft aisles while carrying luggage and thinking only about their own safety. She could also see that some passengers were going to need help that the flight attendants couldn't provide while they were trying to manage the overall evacuation. The elderly woman she had helped earlier was clearly disoriented and frightened. The family with young children was struggling to keep everyone together while preparing to evacuate. Dr. Martinez was still trying to help the hysterical passenger in row 12, but she couldn't assist with the evacuation while providing medical care. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for throughout the entire flight. The immediate danger was over, but a new crisis was beginning, and people were going to need help from someone with the training and experience to provide it. This was when her SEAL capabilities could make a real difference in saving lives and preventing additional injuries. Sarah stood up calmly and began moving toward the front of the aircraft, but not in the panicked rush that characterized most of the other passengers. Instead, she moved with the kind of purposeful, controlled urgency that her military training had taught her to use in crisis situations. She wasn't running toward the exit, she was positioning herself to help other people reach the exit safely. "Sir, you need to leave your carry-on bag," she said firmly to a businessman who was trying to retrieve his luggage from the overhead compartment while blocking the aisle for other passengers. Her voice carried an unmistakable tone of authority that made him stop what he was doing and look at her. "I need my laptop," he protested. "It has important files." "Your life is more important than any files," Sarah replied, her voice calm but absolutely non-negotiable. "Move toward the exit now, and don't try to take anything with you." Something in her tone and manner made the businessman comply immediately, even though he had been ignoring the flight attendants who had been telling him the same thing. Sarah's command presence was different from the airline staff's trained professionalism. She spoke with the kind of absolute authority that comes from having made life-or-death decisions under pressure, and people responded to it instinctively. Sarah quickly realized that her most effective approach would be to work alongside the flight attendants rather than trying to take charge of the entire situation. Rebecca and her colleagues were competent professionals who knew their emergency procedures, but they were overwhelmed by the number of passengers who needed individual assistance. "I have some emergency training," Sarah told Rebecca quietly as she moved past her toward the family with young children. "Can I help with passengers who need assistance?" Rebecca looked at her gratefully. "Yes, please. That family in row 14, and there's an elderly gentleman in row 9 who seems confused." Sarah nodded and immediately went to work. Her approach with the frightened family was remarkably effective, speaking to the parents in a calm, confident voice while simultaneously helping organize the children and their essential belongings. "I know this is scary," she told the mother, who was clearly overwhelmed by trying to manage 3 young children while preparing for an emergency evacuation. "But we're going to get everyone out safely. I need you to pick up your youngest child, and I'll help your older children. We're going to walk calmly toward the exit, and we're not going to rush or push." The mother looked at Sarah with obvious relief. "Are you a flight attendant?" "I'm someone with emergency training who's here to help," Sarah replied, which was technically true while avoiding the need for more detailed explanations. "Right now, the most important thing is getting your family off this aircraft safely." Sarah's calm confidence seemed to spread to the children as well. Instead of the crying and panic that might have been expected from young kids in this situation, they followed her instructions with remarkable cooperation. She had learned during her military service that children often responded better to crisis situations when the adults around them projected genuine calm rather than forced cheerfulness. As they moved toward the exit, Sarah continued to assist other passengers who were struggling with the evacuation. She helped the elderly gentleman in row 9, who was disoriented and having trouble understanding what was happening. She quickly but gently redirected several passengers who were trying to go back for their luggage or who were moving in the wrong direction. Most importantly, she began to organize the evacuation in a way that prioritized the most vulnerable passengers while maintaining the steady flow that was necessary to get everyone off the aircraft quickly. Without making it obvious, she was essentially managing crowd control and triage using techniques she had learned during military operations in civilian disaster areas. Dr. Martinez, who was still providing medical care to the hyperventilating passenger, noticed what Sarah was doing and felt a sense of relief. She had been worried about how they were going to manage all of the passengers who needed individual assistance while maintaining an orderly evacuation, but this quiet woman seemed to have remarkable skill at managing crisis situations. "Are you medical personnel?" Dr. Martinez asked Sarah as she passed by. "I have emergency training," Sarah replied again, which was becoming her standard response to avoid detailed explanations while still being helpful. "How can I assist with your patient?" Together, they were able to help the hyperventilating passenger regain enough composure to evacuate the aircraft safely. Dr. Martinez found herself impressed by Sarah's competence and wondering what kind of emergency training produced such remarkable crisis management skills. Robert Hayes, the elderly veteran, was also watching Sarah with growing interest. His decades of military experience had taught him to recognize certain qualities in people, and this young woman was displaying the kind of calm competence and natural leadership that he associated with highly trained military personnel. But she was clearly trying to keep a low profile, and Robert's instincts told him there was probably a good reason for that. As the evacuation continued, Sarah found herself naturally taking on more responsibility and authority. The situation demanded someone with her skills, and she couldn't stand by and watch people struggle when she had the training to help them. But she was also conscious of the fact that her cover story was becoming increasingly thin as more people noticed her unusual capabilities. The drunk passenger who had been causing problems throughout the flight finally pushed the situation to a breaking point. Frustrated by the evacuation delays and still not fully comprehending the seriousness of what had happened, he became physically aggressive with one of the flight attendants, grabbing her arm and demanding that she get him off this damn plane immediately. That was the moment when Sarah's carefully maintained civilian persona finally cracked, and everyone on Flight 447 was about to discover exactly who had been sitting quietly among them for the past several hours. The moment the drunk passenger grabbed Rebecca's arm and began shaking her aggressively, something fundamental shifted in Sarah Chen's demeanor. The carefully maintained facade of the quiet, unassuming civilian disappeared completely, replaced by something that made every person in the vicinity stop what they were doing and pay attention. Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who had appeared so ordinary just moments before. In less than 3 seconds, she had crossed the distance between herself and the aggressive passenger, applied a control hold that immediately immobilized him without causing injury, and guided him away from Rebecca with such smooth efficiency that many witnesses weren't entirely sure what they had just seen. "Sir, you need to calm down and follow evacuation procedures," Sarah said in a voice that was completely different from the soft, polite tone she had used throughout the flight. This was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately and without question. "You will not touch any member of the crew, and you will exit this aircraft in an orderly fashion. Do you understand?" The drunk passenger, who had been belligerent and argumentative with everyone else, suddenly found himself looking into Sarah's eyes and feeling a level of intimidation that he couldn't explain. There was something in her gaze that suggested she was capable of handling much more serious threats than one intoxicated airline passenger, and that she wouldn't hesitate to do whatever was necessary to protect the people around her. "Yeah, okay, whatever," he mumbled, all of his previous aggression evaporating as he allowed himself to be guided toward the exit. Rebecca stared at Sarah in amazement. "How did you do that? Are you a police officer?" Before Sarah could answer, another crisis demanded her attention. Through the aircraft windows, she could see that smoke was beginning to rise from somewhere near the landing gear area. The emergency vehicles were already responding, but there was a real possibility that the aircraft could catch fire, which would turn their controlled evacuation into a life-or-death race against time. "We need to move faster," Sarah announced to the remaining flight attendants. "There's smoke outside, which means we may have a fire developing. We need everyone off this aircraft in the next 5 minutes." Katie, the younger flight attendant, looked out the window and went pale. "Oh my God, you're right. What do we do?" Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She had been in situations where every second mattered and where leadership meant the difference between life and death for multiple people. This was no longer a time for maintaining her cover or worrying about explanations. People needed help, and she was the most qualified person available to provide it. "Rebecca, how many passengers are still on the aircraft?" Sarah asked, her voice now carrying unmistakable command authority. "Maybe 30 or 40, Rebecca replied, automatically responding to Sarah's tone with the same deference she would show to a senior emergency official. Okay, here's what we're going to do, Sarah continued, taking charge of the situation with natural ease. Katie, you continue evacuating passengers from the front exits. Rebecca, you take the back exits. I'll move through the cabin and make sure we haven't missed anyone, especially passengers who might need medical assistance or physical help with evacuation. Dr. Martinez, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward. I should help with anyone who has medical needs. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good. We'll work together to make sure everyone gets out safely. As they began implementing this plan, Robert Hayes approached Sarah with a look of recognition in his eyes. Excuse me, miss, but what's your background? You're handling this situation like someone with serious emergency training. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, weighing the risks of revealing her identity against the potential benefits of having someone understand her qualifications. The smoke outside was getting thicker, and she could see emergency personnel beginning to prepare for the possibility of a significant fire. This was no longer a situation where she could afford to worry about maintaining her cover. I'm military, she said simply. Navy SEAL. Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. A SEAL? That's not what I was expecting, but it explains a lot. How can I help? Army infantry, Vietnam, and 45 years flying commercial afterward. I need you to help organize the passengers as they exit the aircraft, Sarah replied without missing a beat. Make sure they move away from the plane and gather in a safe area where emergency personnel can account for everyone. Can you do that? Absolutely, Robert replied, moving toward the exits with new purpose. Word of Sarah's revelation began to spread among the remaining passengers and crew members, creating a mixture of amazement and relief. The quiet young woman who had been reading a romance novel at the beginning of the flight was actually one of the most elite warriors in the American military, and she was taking charge of their evacuation with the kind of competence they had desperately needed. Marcus Thompson, the businessman who had been so nervous throughout the flight, approached Sarah as she was helping an elderly couple prepare for evacuation. Did someone say you're a Navy SEAL? I thought all SEALs were men. That's a common misconception, Sarah replied while continuing to assist the elderly passengers. Right now, the important thing is getting everyone safely off this aircraft. We can discuss military demographics later. Her matter-of-fact response to what was clearly a surprised and somewhat skeptical question made it clear that she had dealt with similar reactions before and wasn't particularly interested in defending or explaining her qualifications to anyone. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it regardless of what people thought about her gender or appearance. Dr. Martinez was working alongside Sarah to evacuate the remaining passengers, and she found herself increasingly impressed by the young woman's competence. I have to ask, she said during a brief pause in their work, how does someone become a female Navy SEAL? I didn't know that was possible. It's a long story, Sarah replied. The short version is that I was recruited for a specialized program that focuses on technical skills and intelligence operations rather than traditional combat roles. Turns out that some missions require people who can blend into civilian situations without attracting attention. Dr. Martinez laughed despite the seriousness of their situation. Well, you certainly succeeded at blending in. I had you pegged as a librarian or maybe a teacher. That was the idea, Sarah said with a slight smile. Though right now, I'm just someone trying to make sure everyone gets home safely to their families. As they continued working together, more details about Sarah's background began to emerge through fragments of conversation. The other passengers learned that she had graduated from MIT with degrees in computer engineering and cybersecurity, that she had been specially recruited by the Navy for her technical skills, and that she had been serving as a SEAL for the past 6 years while maintaining her civilian cover. But, even more impressive than her credentials was her performance during the crisis. Sarah moved through the aircraft with calm efficiency, helping passengers who needed assistance while maintaining situational awareness of everything happening around them. She communicated with the flight crew as an equal, providing suggestions and information that helped them manage the evacuation more effectively. Most remarkably, her presence seemed to have a calming effect on everyone around her. Passengers who had been panicked and disorganized began following her instructions and working together more effectively. The flight crew, who had been overwhelmed by the scope of the emergency, found themselves able to focus on their jobs with the confidence that came from having truly competent backup. Rebecca found herself wondering how she could have spent hours serving this woman drinks and snacks without recognizing that she was dealing with someone with such extraordinary capabilities. "You're really good at this," she told Sarah as they helped the last few passengers prepare for evacuation. "I should be," Sarah replied. "This is what I've trained for, even though I hoped I'd never have to use this training in a civilian situation." As the evacuation neared completion, Sarah could see that the smoke outside was getting worse, but the fire department appeared to have the situation under control. More importantly, they had successfully evacuated nearly 200 passengers without any serious injuries or casualties, despite the severity of the aircraft's mechanical problems and the challenging conditions of the emergency landing. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit as the last passengers were leaving the aircraft, looking exhausted but relieved. When he saw Sarah organizing the final stages of the evacuation, he approached her with a puzzled expression. "I don't recognize you as airline personnel," he said. "Are you with emergency services?" "Navy SEAL," Sarah replied, extending her hand for a professional handshake. "Just happened to be on your flight when things went wrong." Captain Rodriguez stared at her for a moment, then broke into the first genuine smile he had displayed since the crisis began. "A SEAL? Well, that explains why this evacuation went so much smoother than I expected. Thank you for your help." "Thank you for getting us on the ground safely," Sarah replied. "That was some impressive flying under very difficult circumstances." As they finally exited the aircraft and joined the crowd of evacuated passengers on the tarmac, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her, ask her questions, or simply express their amazement at what they had just witnessed. The transformation from quiet civilian to competent military professional had been so dramatic that many of them were still trying to process what had happened. But, even as she accepted their gratitude and answered their questions, Sarah was already thinking about what came next. Her cover had been blown in the most public way possible, which would have implications for her future assignments and her carefully maintained double life. More immediately, she would need to deal with the inevitable media attention and official inquiries that would result from this incident. However, as she looked around at the faces of the passengers and crew members who had made it safely off the aircraft, Sarah realized that she had no regrets about the choices she had made during the crisis. Sometimes protecting people meant revealing secrets that were supposed to stay hidden. Sometimes being a hero meant giving up the anonymity that had defined her civilian life. For the first time in 6 years, Sarah Chen was standing in public as exactly who she really was, a Navy SEAL who had risked her own safety to help others. And, despite all the complications this would create, it felt surprisingly liberating to finally be seen for who she truly was rather than who she had been pretending to be. 6 hours after Flight 447 made its emergency landing in Atlanta, Sarah Chen found herself in a situation that was almost as surreal as the crisis on the aircraft had been. She was sitting in a comfortable conference room at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, surrounded by airline executives, FAA investigators, military personnel, and media relations specialists, all trying to figure out how to handle the unprecedented situation of a covert Navy SEAL who had been forced to reveal her identity during a civilian emergency. The immediate aftermath of the evacuation had been chaotic in ways that Sarah's military training hadn't entirely prepared her for. While she was accustomed to post-mission debriefings and operational security concerns, she had never dealt with civilian media, social media, and the kind of public attention that came from being a hero in a very public crisis. Several passengers had recorded cell phone videos during the evacuation, and, within hours of the emergency landing, footage of Sarah calmly directing the evacuation and taking charge of the situation had gone viral across multiple social media platforms. The contrast between her quiet demeanor at the beginning of the flight and her competent leadership during the crisis had captured the public imagination in a way that no one had anticipated. The hashtag #SailSarah was already trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing the story and expressing their amazement at what they had witnessed. News organizations were running stories about the mystery female SEAL who had helped save lives during a commercial airline emergency. Military officials were fielding calls from reporters who wanted to know more about female SEAL programs and how someone like Sarah could have been operating in secret for so long. Commander Patricia Williams, the Navy psychologist who had originally recommended Sarah for the experimental SEAL program, had flown to Atlanta immediately after being notified about the situation. She was now sitting across from Sarah in the conference room, trying to assess the implications of what had happened for both Sarah's career and the larger military program she represented. "Well, your cover is definitely blown," Commander Williams said with a wry smile. "The question now is whether we try to contain the story or embrace it." Sarah looked tired but remarkably composed considering everything she had been through. "I'm sorry about compromising the program. I know how important operational security is for this kind of work." "Don't apologize," Commander Williams replied firmly. "You made exactly the right decisions under very difficult circumstances. People are alive today because of what you did, and that's always going to be more important than maintaining cover." Colonel James Harrison, a senior military public affairs officer who had also been called in to manage the situation, leaned forward in his chair. "The bigger question is what we do now. This story isn't going away, and we have an opportunity to control the narrative if we handle it correctly." Around the table, the various officials and executives were grappling with a situation that none of them had ever encountered before. The existence of female SEALs was not technically classified information, but it hadn't been publicized either. The experimental nature of the program and the small number of women involved had made it easy to keep the whole initiative out of the public eye. Now, suddenly, they had a female SEAL who was being celebrated as a hero by millions of people who had previously had no idea that women could serve in such roles. The public reaction had been overwhelmingly positive, with people expressing pride and admiration for Sarah's service and her competence during the emergency. Dr. Martinez, who had been asked to stay for the debriefing because of her role during the crisis, spoke up from her seat at the end of the table. "If I can offer a civilian perspective, I think Sarah's story is exactly what people need to hear right now. She represents something that challenges a lot of assumptions while also embodying values that everyone can respect." Rebecca, the flight attendant who had worked most closely with Sarah during the evacuation, nodded in agreement. "The passengers haven't stopped talking about her. They keep saying how grateful they are and how impressed they were by her competence. Nobody seems to care that she's a woman or that the program was secret. They just care that she was there when they needed help." Robert Hayes, the elderly veteran, had also been included in the debriefing, and his perspective carried particular weight given his decades of military experience. "I've served with a lot of people over the years," he said in his gravelly voice, "and I can tell you that what matters in a crisis is competence, courage, and character. This young woman has all three in spades. The military should be proud to have her, and the public deserves to know that we have people like her serving our country." Sarah listened to these discussions about her future with mixed feelings. Part of her was relieved that she no longer had to maintain her exhausting double life, constantly switching between her civilian and military personas. The stress of keeping such a significant secret from family and friends had been taking a psychological toll that she was only now beginning to recognize. But she was also concerned about what this exposure would mean for her ability to continue serving as a SEAL. Much of her effectiveness had depended on her ability to blend into civilian situations without attracting attention. Now that her face and story were known to millions of people, that kind of covert work would be impossible. Commander Williams seemed to understand what Sarah was thinking. "You're worried about whether you can continue serving effectively after this exposure?" Sarah nodded. "A lot of what I do depends on being able to operate without being recognized. That's not going to be possible anymore." "That's true," Commander Williams agreed. "But there are other ways to serve, and other roles where your experience and skills would be invaluable. The Navy has been looking for ways to expand opportunities for women in special operations, and your story could help open doors for other qualified candidates." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly considering various options. "We could offer you a role in recruitment and training. There are a lot of young women who could benefit from knowing that someone like you exists and that these opportunities are available to them." Sarah had to admit that the idea was appealing. Throughout her service, she had occasionally encountered other women who had the potential to succeed in special operations but didn't know that such opportunities existed. If her story could inspire other qualified women to pursue similar careers, that would be a form of service that might be even more valuable than her individual contributions. The media relations specialist, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Walsh, spoke up with practical concerns. Whatever we decide about Sarah's future role, we need to manage the immediate media situation. There are reporters trying to track down her family, her neighbors, her co-workers. We need to get ahead of this story before it spirals out of control. Sarah winced at the thought of her family and friends learning about her secret life through news reports rather than from her directly. I need to call my parents and my co-workers before they see this on the news.
Absolutely, Commander Williams agreed.
But we should also consider doing a controlled media appearance where you can tell your story in your own words. That way we can focus on the positive aspects of your service rather than letting others speculate about classified details. As the discussion continued, Sarah began to see a path forward that felt both realistic and meaningful. She could transition from covert operations to a more public role that would allow her to continue serving while also helping to expand opportunities for other women in the military. 3 days later, Sarah found herself sitting across from a respected television journalist in a network studio, preparing to tell her story to a national audience for the first time. The decision to do the interview had been carefully considered, with input from military lawyers and public affairs specialists who had helped her prepare for the kinds of questions she might face. The interview began with footage from the airplane evacuation, showing Sarah calmly directing passengers and working alongside the flight crew to ensure everyone's safety. Then, the camera focused on Sarah herself, sitting comfortably in professional attire that reflected both her civilian and military backgrounds. Sarah Chen, you've been serving as a Navy SEAL for 6 years, but, until this week, almost no one knew that women could serve in such roles, the journalist began.
Can you tell us about your journey to becoming a SEAL?
Sarah smiled, looking more relaxed than she had felt in years. It started with a technical background and a desire to serve my country in a meaningful way. I was recruited for my computer skills, but I discovered that I also had the mental and physical capabilities to succeed in special operations. What was the training like? The journalist asked. Challenging in every possible way, Sarah replied honestly. But also incredibly rewarding. I learned capabilities I never knew I had, both physical and mental. More importantly, I learned to be part of a team where everyone's life depends on everyone else's competence and commitment. The interview continued for nearly an hour, covering Sarah's background, her training, her service, and her thoughts about the future. Throughout the conversation, she came across as articulate, thoughtful, and genuinely passionate about her military service. But the most powerful moment came when the journalist asked about her decision to reveal her identity during the airplane emergency. I never hesitated, Sarah said simply. When people need help and you have the training to provide it, you provide it. That's what service means. It doesn't matter whether you're on a classified mission or a commercial flight. If you can help, you help. The interview ended with Sarah discussing her plans to transition into a training and recruitment role, where she hoped to identify and mentor other women who might have the potential to succeed in special operations. There are a lot of young women out there who could do this job, she said. They just need to know that the opportunity exists and that someone believes in their potential. If my story helps make that happen, then all of this exposure will have been worth it. 6 months later, Sarah was working at the Navy's Special Warfare Training Center, developing programs to identify and train women for special operations roles. The experimental program that had produced her had been expanded and formalized, with Sarah playing a key role in establishing standards and procedures for future candidates. She still missed the adrenaline and challenge of operational assignments, but she had found deep satisfaction in her new role as a mentor and advocate. The young women she worked with reminded her of her own journey from uncertain civilian to confident warrior, and helping them navigate that transformation felt like a natural continuation of her service. More importantly, Sarah had finally found a way to live as one person instead of two. She no longer had to maintain elaborate cover stories or hide her most meaningful accomplishments from the people closest to her. For the first time in years, she could simply be Sarah Chen, MIT graduate, Navy SEAL, and someone who had learned that being true to yourself often meant being willing to sacrifice the safety of anonymity for the responsibility of setting an example. The quiet woman who had boarded Flight 447 with a romance novel and a carefully maintained secret had become something she never expected to be, a public figure whose story inspired others to pursue their own extraordinary possibilities. And, while that transformation had been frightening and unexpected, Sarah had discovered that being seen for who she truly was felt infinitely better than hiding behind who she was pretending to be.